if silver was just an industrial commodity, that part of the story would be good enough to make it a strong buy in the longer term. If you're stacking, if you're buying a few silver coins a month, there's no reason to stop that, no matter what the price goes to in the short run, because the longer term story is phenomenal.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for February 9th through February 16th, 2026, while supplies last. First this week, pre-1933 XF Gold $5 Liberty coins are just $89 over melt per coin. Next, 2-ounce silver Canadian Rockies coins are just $6.35 over spot per ounce. And finally, 1-ounce Platinum Nobles are only $170 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options that we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. I'm always privileged to welcome back this returning guest, John Rubino, the founder of DollarCollapse.com and author of books on investing, joins us this Tuesday, February 10th, 2026. John, thanks for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Hey, Dunnigan, thanks for having me back.
It's always a treat for us, for our viewers. You have a reputation here of publishing numerous types of analyses that are very easy to understand, put in everyday terms, and yet deal with extremely relevant topics in a constructive and productive and often giving actionable steps that people can take near the end rather than just leaving us wringing our hands in despair. Right now, we want to talk about at least three things with you. One is the roller coaster ride that we've been on and perhaps are still on with the silver market dominating that volatility, what we know about what's been driving it, and what we can tell based on the indications of what lies ahead. We also wanted to talk with you about the upcoming flurry of action just prior to the Chinese New Year closure of the Shanghai physical market, which has been actually a breath of fresh air in contrast to the paper trade dominated COMEX market over the last year or so, and what that might signify going forward. And then thirdly, we want to talk to you about this distressing series of events surrounding the release or partial release of the Epstein files and what it reveals to us about the two-tier status of ordinary people versus elites, and how that might have a crossover effect between not only moral affairs, but also financial affairs, and sometimes those two are very much intertwined. So with your permission, let's jump right on in and start talking about what we've just are riding right now, which is the silver roller coaster. Let us know what you've been watching from your seat.
Yeah, silver is an amazing story. And it's, for maybe the past 3 or 4 months, has been basically the most exciting place to have any money invested. Now, the background of silver is great because it's got two stories, really. One is the monetary metal, and when gold goes up because currencies are being debased, silver comes along with it. The other, it's an industrial metal that we're kind of running out of. Each year, industry uses more silver than mines produce, and the silver that's left over, that's been in inventory all along, is shrinking. And there's some question about whether the paper exchanges are going to see enough physical demand that it taps them out and they have to default. And that's the really timely part of the story here. Although there's another timely part also, and that is that Chinese trading is shutting down for a week because of a holiday. And that just leaves the paper markets where all the manipulation happens operating. So we could see a huge amount of volatility in the next week or two, but that barely matters from the point of view of stackers, the people who have just been buying a little more silver each month or whatever, because the long-term story is so great. So my advice for the next few weeks would be to enjoy the volatility from a safe distance. Don't be too wrapped up in it, because the underlying fundamentals are great. Just stick with your silver positions. Don't let a big drop on any one of these days shake you out, because any big drop that happens in the next week or two will be reversed out once everything goes back to normal.
Yeah, the beauty of doing incremental acquisitions of an asset that you know is scarce and irreplaceable and in limited supply and so on is that when there are intermittent times of price volatility, that can become an opportunity to add to your position, and yet you don't have to panic with everyone. We had a number of clients calling up frenzied over the past week and a half saying, what should I do? What should I do? It looks like the bottom is falling out. And to remind everyone, as you just did, that the fundamentals have not changed at all. The fundamental need for both investing and industrial demand, the identification of silver as a strategic material by multiple countries, the persistent structural supply-demand deficit. Any other comments about the things that aren't changing, the things that are staying the same while we see the price fluctuating?
Well, yeah, silver is a long-term story, and it's just a very good story. So you just want to be riding that train, and you can do it gradually. People can call you up and buy a few silver coins every couple of weeks or every month or whatever, and they'll do just fine over time. And if you're an investor in the miners, the gold and silver miners, then you've got a really interesting month ahead of you right now, because the price of gold and silver are way up, which means the miners, especially the high quality miners who control their costs, are looking at massive increases in earnings and cash flow at least in the coming earnings cycle, and probably much longer, further out than that. So the earnings reports that these miners are going to release in late February and early March are going to be great. And assuming there's no big trauma going on in the market at the time, it ought to have a positive impact on the mining stocks. So if you're dollar cost averaging or using lowball bids or whatever to get into the mining stocks, you've probably got a good month or two at least in which they put up positive surprises over and over again. And the people who are paying attention to earnings momentum and cash flow levels and things like that are very possibly going to be piling into this market. So we got lots of volatility in the physical market and really good earnings reports in the mining sector to make this a really exciting month going forward.
Your mention of the mining stocks reminds me that our last interview with Rick Rule just a couple weeks ago, he rather surprised our audience by saying that he was so much intrigued by the value opportunity he saw in the mining shares, because he said normally at this stage of a gold and silver precious metals bull market, you see a lot of capital pouring into those sectors, and you see the miners outperforming the metals themselves by multiples. And yet he said what he was seeing was almost the opposite, that the amount of money pouring into the metals wasn't buoying the miners as much as it normally would on a percentage basis. So he was actually reallocating some of his capital into what he considered a special value opportunity of the miners at this time, trying to be ahead of that rush that typically will come when the public suddenly wakes up and sees this cavalcade of higher than expected and higher than price would suggest, price to earnings growth and all that sort of thing, ratios. So good reminder on that. It also reminds us of this volatility that we just saw in the silver market was something that for the past year or so, claims had been made that the physical markets in the East, the Shanghai market, the Moscow and others, were starting to dominate because of the true underlying physical shortage that's looming, and that the paper futures derivative games that have been played for perhaps decades in the Western markets, notably the COMEX and the LBMA, were losing their ability to control and be the drivers, or at least the sole drivers, of price action on the exchanges. You'd see almost a daily, nightly cycle where things would get hammered down in the daytimes in the COMEX, and then they'd just claw their way right back up again on the overnight hours when the Asian markets were dominating. your expectation of that mega trend in the big picture, first of all, and then later on you said, you gave us a caution that might be an interruption in that for the next week or so with the Chinese New Year.
Yeah, physical is finally, I mean, we've been talking about this for over a decade, right? Someday physical is going to start dominating, and then the price will go way up because of that. And then, that's playing out according to the script, except it took a lot longer than it should have. But what we're seeing in the physical market isn't just industrial demand. And industrial demand is a very big deal. Solar panels and electric cars and power plants. They all need silver along with a lot of other critical minerals. But governments are getting into this now too. Russia, China, and India are buying a lot of metals, including silver. The U.S. just announced that it was going to set up a critical mineral stockpile, and silver is included on that list too. So not only do you have, Tesla and Google out there buying a lot of silver, but you've got the big governments of the world too. So the wind is absolutely at the back of silver right now, because you've got these big players who, in the case of governments, they can literally print money. And in the case of a lot of these big corporations, they can print something better than money, which is new high-powered shares of common stock. So, you've got a tremendous amount of potential demand out there on the physical side, and nowhere near enough physical metal to satisfy all the demand if everybody does what they say they're going to. Google, for instance, just announced, or Alphabet announced their revised capital spending for the year ahead, and it was way up. It was already high, and now it's up to like $185 billion or something like that. And a lot of that is going to go into AI data centers, which use varying amounts of silver. And you've got these new electric car batteries coming online a year or so from now that apparently are much better than today's batteries, and they use a lot of silver. So you got things like that out there in the market where governments are not price sensitive. They're buying because they need it as part of their national security policy. Companies that know they're going to need a lot of silver going forward, and they can't shut down their production lines because they run out, so they have to buy without a lot of price sensitivity. And these new technologies coming on board that use varying amounts of silver, but also can't just be shut down because silver isn't available or it's doing things that it shouldn't be doing. They all have to have silver. So if silver was just an industrial commodity, that part of the story would be good enough to make it a strong buy in the longer term. As Rick Rule said, sometimes the mining stocks will do better than the metals, and this might be one of those times. But, if you're stacking, if you're buying a few silver coins a month, there's no reason to stop that, no matter what the price goes to in the short run, because the longer term story is phenomenal. Oh, and then there's Elon Musk announcing that he's going to put data centers in space. Presumably that's going to use some silver along with a lot of other important metals and minerals too. So, wherever you look, you've got something going on that's both unprecedented and really positive for silver.
Now, what about this expected week off for the Chinese New Year? Every year this happens, the Lunar New Year, but this year it's from like February 14th through 23rd. You said just before we started taping that there are some actual margin requirement changes being put out by the Shanghai exchange ahead of that, or explain to me what restrictions.
This was to do with futures in China. They were increasing margin requirements, and I don't know the details beyond that, but that's the kind of trick that the Western metals exchanges use when the price of something is getting out of hand. They'll start raising the margin requirements, which makes it harder to gamble in the futures market. So you got fewer people gambling, which means fewer people standing for delivery, and that protects the physical inventories on the exchanges. And, I don't know if they're doing it in China with the same objective, but they are doing it. And usually the impact of something like that is to lower the price of the target commodity, because you take away some of the potential demand and the price goes down. And that's happened in silver a bunch of times and in a lot of other commodities too. So it wouldn't be a huge surprise to see a lot of volatility while China is basically offline, or the Chinese physical markets at least are offline. And I'm sorry that that especially new silver investors have to live through something like that if it comes, but it's just part of a bull market. Stuff happens, prices fluctuate, but where the prices end up depend on fundamentals. And in this case, silver's fundamentals are just great. So not to worry if there's volatility in the next couple of weeks. Just treat it as a buying opportunity.
Well, I can't help but put these two topics that we've just talked about together and look at that. Just look at that. One is the unprecedented, I guess, escalation of silver as a strategic material, getting the attention of huge corporations and governments and militaries. Okay, suddenly the big boys realize they need it, they want it, and they can't rely on paper promises. They've got to have the real thing. And oh, by the way, coincidentally, at that same time, tightening restrictions by the exchanges, accommodating those who would be needing lower prices. And it's like, okay, big elite forces that need a lot of silver all of a sudden that weren't paying any attention to it for, decades. Now suddenly lowering of the prices by the exchanges. It wasn't just a few years ago we saw a runaway in prices on the silver market and the nickel market, and then rules got changed all of a sudden and trades got canceled and rolled back, and these big, supposedly some really big ticket players got protected, members of the exchange, and others were left out in the cold, the smaller speculators. Do you see any connection between these two stories that happen to be happening at the same time?
Well, yeah, it could be that they're trying to force down the paper price of silver and hope the physical price follows, so some of those big players get to step in and buy a lot of physical. That's par for the course for the commodities markets. You can never know what's going on behind the scenes. You can never trust a given trend because it can be reversed out in a heartbeat. So all you can really do is look at the fundamentals long term and position yourself so that when fundamentals finally dominate pricing, you're on the right side of that market, and in the meantime, I heard from a lot of friends who were kind of new to the silver market just lately when it tanked, because they were thinking, wow, okay, it's been going up for a year, so all I have to do is buy call options. And then it'll go up for another year and I'll make a fortune. And they were totally baffled when it just tanked because it didn't occur to them that was a possibility. And it is a possibility. It happens in all bull markets, especially markets that are easily manipulated like commodities. So we just have to live with that. And again, you can turn it to your advantage if you have lowball bids in on mining stocks or something like that. They tank and you get them for 20 or 30% off today's prices, then they go back up. And that's a very common pattern, and it's one that could repeat this time very easily. It's easy to conceive of a 30% drop in the average silver miner and gold miner, followed by a nice big run back up to today's levels. So, if you've got the risk tolerance to be able to treat that like a buying opportunity, then it is an opportunity.
You used a word just a minute back, the word trust. And this is something that I was hoping you'd bring up because you've written a very intriguing series of articles called the Shrinking Trust Horizon. And that leads into our next point that I think is tied in an interesting way to everything we've been talking about so far, and that is the release of the Epstein files. And that what we were just talking about a moment ago was this notion that there are different strata. There's the ordinary retail investor who's struggling to try to figure out how to make sure that you either get ahead or at least don't lose. And then you've got these very almost, it seems, infinitely powerful, whether it's governments who can print money or corporations who can print shares that can make, and the exchanges that can change the rules and basically just tip the whole chessboard in whatever direction they want to. And as George Carlin said, it's a big club and you're not in it. So what about that idea that's been evidenced in the strange scenarios surrounding the so-called release of the Epstein files as far as demonstrating this stratification of humanity into elite that are above an untouchable glass ceiling, or at least believe they are, and the rest of humanity that has to deal with consequences for their actions.
Yeah, it's over the past decade or so, it's becoming clearer and clearer to more and more people that we're run by an aristocracy that is both incompetent and corrupt. And, you know, whether it's geopolitics with all these stupid wars, or monetary policy with raging inflation somewhere out there on the horizon because too much money is being created now, or public health, which, you know, let's not delve too deeply into the whole COVID thing, but a lot of people lost their faith in government during that time. And so fewer and fewer people trust the big systems, which is part of why gold and silver are going up, because that's where people go when they don't trust the elites running monetary policy. They go back to the old kinds of money that governments can't create more of. So we're seeing that. So we're seeing a response to diminishing trust in every aspect of life. You know, people are homeschooling their kids. They're looking into alternative medical treatments and
Yep, home remedies, or Eastern or whatever, herbal.
And completely ignoring vaccines and other pharmaceuticals because they don't trust the guys who make those anymore, you know? And then, so wherever you look, you see something like that. And now this Epstein thing is just, that's the icing on the cake. You know, when these emails come out, you know, I should kind of take this opportunity to apologize here, because I did a post on Epstein and the shrinking trust horizon. And I said the biggest surprise to me was how dumb a lot of these people are. You know, their emails and their texts don't make them sound like they have multiple PhDs and they're running big sectors of the world, you know, because they're the Larry Summers and Noam Chomskys of the world. They're, most people used to think, super geniuses, but they don't come off that way at all. But anyhow, I got a little blowback from that, because a lot of other people found other things even more surprising in the Epstein files. And now the stuff that's coming out, I'll grant you, is more surprising than that these people are inarticulate, you know, because the Pizzagate thing, that whole idea that there is a pedophile ring being run out of a pizza place was totally dismissed as QAnon nonsense and everything. But now from these emails, it turns out that pizza and grape soda was a euphemism for, it looks like, young girls that were available to be raped. And so there was kind of a Pizzagate thing in all of this. And it goes on and on. And, you know, there are so many things that are coming out. And by the way, there's a ton more material that hasn't been looked at yet. But so much of this stuff is coming out, and it implies a global pedophilia / sex trafficking ring was being run by Epstein, and that these little girls were being trafficked. You know, it looks like that now. And so, you know, you put all that together along with these emails from and texts from these famous, powerful people who were participating in this. And then you think, okay, well, these are the guys who run public health, and they run monetary policy, and they run geopolitics for the US and Europe. Should we ever trust them with anything? You know, shouldn't we throw them in prison instead of trusting them? And so this is another big deal in the shrinking trust horizon. But yeah, it's reaching the point now where, you know, the average family is going to be homeschooling their kids, taking care of their own health care, and just completely ignoring the big systems out there that are trying to tell them what to do. So I think it's a lot healthier, you know. So if all of this stuff that has happened over the past 10 years that are just horrendous, if that's the price we pay for waking up and learning that we need to take care of our own lives, you know, we basically need to prep for what is going to be a gigantic crisis coming our way, then okay, it's a price worth paying if it educates a critical mass of people.
Another area that you touched on briefly, but it's worth focusing on for a moment, is the concept of loss of faith and trust in the justice system, or justice in general. You remember the day after 9/11 happened, the front page of the newspapers showed boom, 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 photos of all of these hijackers, like boom. All it took was one night of printing papers to have basically busted everybody who was supposedly the named and identified conspirators that supposedly did this heinous act. And then you have things like the Epstein files, where for months and years, it's like watching a juggler who can't keep anything in the air. Oh, whoops, can't figure out how to, like, nobody getting indicted, nobody going to prison, nobody paying a price. Oh, we have to, first there, was a hoax. Then, oh no, we can't release this to protect the victims, and on and on. And we're going to release it, but it's all going to be redacted. This can't escape the view, the watchful eyes of ordinary people who go, okay, I can see in front of me that when there's a crisis, whether it's created or not, and I'm presented with, here's the cause, here's the guilty parties, we're going to make sure justice is done, we got to go to war, or whatever, versus when there's something that's not where we're supposed to find accountability, we can't find it. We just can't find it. We can't find the evidence. We can't find anything. Any comments from you on this broken trust in justice in general?
Yeah, it is important to note that despite all this information where we've got names on either end of the emails and the texts, and it's a reasonable inference what they're talking about when they're talking about pizza and grape soda and beef jerky and stuff like that, there hasn't been a single arrest other than the two principals, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. The rest of these guys are just walking around free. So in a healthy criminal justice system, their emails and texts and phone calls would have been tapped a decade ago. And then the crimes that they admitted to in their communications would have been traced back to the actual physical aspects of it. And those guys would be in prison now, Didn't happen, hasn't happened. So I think a growing number of people are coming to the conclusion that that the criminal justice system was in on this, and specifically that Epstein was a honeypot operation by Mossad and the CIA. I think the majority of people who are actually paying attention to this stuff have concluded that, and that's why Epstein and Maxwell and the rest of those guys got away with it for as long as they did, because it was serving the perceived national interest of some powerful countries. Because really, I mean, if you seduce a rich, powerful guy into some kind of really compromising position, you own him. That guy is your slave from then on. And so, let's say that this honeypot produced a couple of thousand billionaires who could be blackmailed into doing whatever the government wanted. The government thinks that's a good deal. They're willing to sacrifice a few thousand little girls in order to gain that kind of power. And the average person looks at that and says, no, it is absolutely not worth the price, and something has to be done about this. So, here we are.
Yeah, that's where I was hoping we would go next with this, is the idea of compromised so-called leaders. We interviewed Catherine Austin Fitts, and she talks about everyone with any level of authority has a control collar put on them the day that they step into their job, and whether it's incriminating false things put on their laptop, or whether it's situations like this that actually occurred that allows them. But it leads to a question, because we interviewed Jerry Robinson from from Bankruptcy of Our Nation, author of that, who said, you need to realize that who you think are the head people, like the front man of a band, the president and their cabinet or whatever, they're just middle management. And so when you talk about the governments like to have people under control, I think it's important to qualify people that, well, wait a minute, this is the top, the president's the most powerful man in the world or whatever. And yet I think you're talking about the deep state, because when we attended the Ron Paul Institute's Peace and Prosperity Conference in Washington, D.C., Thomas Massey said, he referred constantly to the operatives of the deep state as something, and that's what Catherine Austin Fitts refers to as Mr. Global. So can you distinguish for us, when we say governments, it's not the people that we got elected who necessarily wanted this to happen, but they may be walking into this quagmire. Yeah,
you're right. We should specify that there's a layer of power that sits above the president and the British prime minister, et cetera, et cetera. they have the power to destroy the lives of the people that sit below them on the rungs below. And, most governments serve them. And that's the big banks and the arms makers and, CEOs across the board and people who are even deeper in who we just don't know who they are, but they have immense amounts of power. So call it an aristocracy. There are people who exist for whom the rules don't apply and who everyone else has to listen to because, the alternative is to have your family murdered or something like that. And they call the shots. Now, the question is, are enough of those guys implicated in the Epstein files that we actually get some of them? Some of those guys go to prison. That would be awesome, but it's, so far it hasn't happened. And a lot of people think it's unlikely because those guys really are above the law. And, historically, that's not unusual from a human nature standpoint. Power without any kind of consequence is infinitely corrupting. So you can go back through European aristocratic history and find horrible things, that those guys did because they could totally get away with it. The Roman Empire, same thing. And pretty much any empire you want to point to, you had people in charge who did horrible things because they could. And I think we're back there now. We have people in charge who absolutely do not believe that there's any consequence for their actions. And so they're able just to let fly. They're able to indulge any impulse. And I think that's a lot of what Epstein did was he said to those people, you know what? You're in your deep, dark fantasies, things that you don't even talk to your spouse about. There are some things that I can get for you. And a lot of those people decided that it was possible to get those things without consequence. And that's where we are now. Maybe there's a little bit of consequence, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, that's the old saying that if you want to find out who's really in charge in any situation, find out who it is you cannot criticize, or in this case, to whom no consequences apply, apparently, in this world. We and our viewers often hold a common view of a higher spiritual reality that where there will be consequences, but we can certainly see a lot of examples in this world where there appear to be no consequences to wrongdoers. Let's bring it all the way back to the individual, because that's one thing that I appreciate so much about your writings and your work is you often, after you cast this big spotlight on things that are happening on the global scale, then you bring it down to actionable things people could do in their life. So if we live in this world where we're sitting here trying to make ends meet, paying our taxes dutifully to a system that's not only corrupt, but actively hostile to changing the rules at whim to make it more and more difficult for people to have a financial future or freedom or privacy or be able to keep their morals and values intact and hand them on to their children without interference from the government schools and so on. What are some key elements that you remind people in your writing that they can and should do that are right there under their control, in their lap, to have some influence over their financial life, their privacy, their freedom, right now where we are living right now?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that there are some categories of people who maybe we didn't take seriously in the past, but who turned out to be right. And they are the preppers, the survivalists, and our grandparents. They had the right idea about a lot of this stuff. And they were, in a lot of ways, way more self-sufficient than most people are today. And self-sufficiency and resilience are the things that we ought to be cultivating. And so you do that. You do that on a lot of levels. One is if you've got the ability to have a garden where you can grow half your food, do that. It's spiritually really nurturing to do something like that. And it insulates you from crazy times when the food supply chain or whatever might be affected. Be able to defend yourself. Now is definitely the time to have one or two guns on hand, just because the world is getting crazier all the time, and you cannot trust the authorities to protect you in a lot of cases. And with your money, move as much of your financial assets away from government-dependent instruments like treasury bonds or something like that. Something that depends on the dollar for its value. Get out of there, get into things that are real, like gold and silver and oil wells and farmland. Those are things that can't be created out of thin air. Become more of a part of your community. You don't want to be just that guy in a cabin with a bunch of guns, because you're easy pickings then. But if you are part of a community where a bunch of people have your back and you've got their back, that is true resilience. And you want to cultivate that if it's possible. Join a church, get involved in the homeschooling of your kids and make friends with those parents. There's a lot of things you can do where you meet people who are very useful in a crisis. And you should be cultivating that kind of a life now. And it goes on and on. But, those are some pretty big things that our grandparents just innately understood. And the preppers and the survivalists kind of came to understand. And now I think it's time for the broadest possible part of the population to start picking up on this stuff and acting accordingly.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is just traditional wisdom, is time-proven living. Now, you write about this as well as all of these geopolitical and financial topics on a recurring basis on your blog. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, all of these things are really interesting subjects. And so I've got threads and series on everything we just talked about on Substack. And the biggest part of it is investing strategies. And what's coming in the next month is a series of posts that look at the earnings of the mining companies and some of the other related commodities-based companies, because they're going to be putting out phenomenal reports. And so I'll dig into them and explain what those numbers mean from the standpoint of an investor. And a lot of that because, the specific names in my Substack portfolio are behind the paywall. A lot of these articles will be too, but it's possible to sign up for a $5 a month subscription, and that lets you go behind the paywall for a couple of months and see all these mining earnings reports and things like that, and then decide if going further is a good idea.
Well, we'll put a link near the very top of the description of this video to your Substack so that people who want to check that out can do so. And folks, I've been receiving the free teaser emails that John sends out, and the articles behind those teasers are extremely and consistently well written, well thought through, and conveyed, as you see, very easily understood. So, John, thank you as always for joining us on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks, Donegan. Talk to you soon.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for February 9th through February 16th, 2026, while supplies last. First this week, pre-1933 XF Gold $5 Liberty coins are just $89 over melt per coin. Next, 2-ounce silver Canadian Rockies coins are just $6.35 over spot per ounce. And finally, 1-ounce Platinum Nobles are only $170 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options that we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.